For Star Wars fans, the Thrawn Trilogy really needs no introduction. There's a lot that has been said about it, and that could be said about it. Today I want to focus on something a little different. Instead of talking about the most commonly spoken of things, which is to say Thrawn himself, and perhaps a couple of the other characters, I want to specifically talk about what he did right in moving forward with the Star Wars story. The Thrawn Trilogy wasn't precisely the first expanded universe story to exist, but it was definitely among the first and is often credited as being the first proper novel to be added. So Timothy Zahn could define a lot of what happened after Return of the Jedi in his books, and the choices he made had a lot of influence in what came after. So I want to examine what went right with the Thrawn Trilogy as a sequel to the original Star Wars movies. Firstly, we need to talk about the state of the galaxy, which is largely going to be talking about the New Republic and the Empire. When we enter the story, we first start with the perspective of the Empire being shown. We immediately see that it is not what it used to be, having to field less ships and be crewed by less experienced people, even on the flagship of its current leader. The Empire spends much of this trilogy trying to overcome its disadvantage, namely the shortage of military assets, not having as many troops or ships as it used to, instead having to rely on hit-and-run tactics and other small engagements to continue fighting what is now the New Republic. The New Republic is actually facing similar issues. We see that it is trying to make the adjustment from being a rather militant organization to an actual government, and having to deal with the fact that it must now protect a lot of its members and maintain trade lanes on top of that. A lot of drama is made from the fact that the heroes, as part of the New Republic, must now deal with new requirements for their time and effort. I'll get into this more when I talk about Leia because it mostly affects her, but there's an actual degree of political intrigue to the story. It is by no means a focus, but it is certainly present. But importantly, the core idealism that made the Rebel Alliance is still very much here. What political maneuvering and, well, desire for power there is mostly encapsulated by the character of Boris Felia, who is mostly portrayed as an ambitious politician willing to use subterfuge and backroom dealing to get ahead. Otherwise, despite the debates between practicality and idealism, the New Republic is chiefly portrayed as an idealistic organization trying to get a handle on practical concerns as best as possible. Between the Empire and the Republic, the state of the galaxy is a little vague. Although it is clear that at this point the Empire is on a waning trend, it's clearly not finished. The story is placed 5 years after the Battle of Endor, and is even commented on in character through Leia, that history will probably say the war was won at the Battle of Endor, and the rest is mopping up, but that has taken 5 years and it doesn't show any sign of stopping. This works fairly well because anyone who's only seen the movies would assume that that would be the definitive point of victory for the rebellion, and that the Empire afterwards should be defeated, or at least not have the power that it would have before the Emperor's death. These years after Endor are not defined, but Zahn does vaguely allude to the weakening of the Empire. Other writers would later come in and find a logical way for the Empire to break apart and weaken, mostly through its noble succession crisis and its splintering into warlord factions. But here, Timothy Zahn leaves it vague, while also making it follow how you would feel after the return of the Jedi. After this, most everything I'd like to talk about could be addressed by talking about individual characters one by one, mostly the main characters from the movies and the new characters. I'm going to talk about Thrawn himself only briefly, just to get him out of the way. There are a lot of people out there who've had things to say about Thrawn, good and bad, so I don't really feel like I should be getting deep into him here. You've probably heard it all before, but to be brief, Thrawn is essentially a criminal mastermind archetype character translated into a sort of military fiction role. When you stop and look at what he does, most of his victories, or at least the most impressive things that he does, are more psychological in nature. It's more about manipulating people and what they think than actual military strategy, though there is some of that. Though not enough to really satisfy actual military fiction fans, as far as I can tell at least. Something I do feel does need to be pointed out is his often exaggerated abilities. Thrawn is definitely portrayed as a genius character, but a lot of fans, and indeed even some haters, if I can use that word, often portray Thrawn as nearly unstoppable, as always winning. But in the story, what you see is a lot of small victories that are just adding up to aiding his ultimate goal of honestly just revitalizing the Empire's war effort with new assets. His entire plan in the first two books is just to find more ships for the Empire to use for the war, and it really isn't until the third book that he starts getting major victories, having finally gotten these new assets. This is actually pretty normal for a villain in general, especially a criminal mastermind type villain, who has to spend the first part of his story setting up his master plan, and the third part is usually when it gets set into motion and the heroes have to stop it. Aside from Thrawn, we do get a couple of other new villain characters. One, briefly, is Captain Pellaeon. Like Thrawn, Pellaeon is a nice change of pace from how the Imperial officers were portrayed in the movies. In the movies, most of the Imperial officers were pretty basic bad guys. There are some slight differences in personality, but they were just the bad guys there. Pellaeon is a little different. He's a mix between an old guard archetypical soldier and the authoritarian that you would expect out of the Empire. He chiefly plays a role as being a sort of Watson-type character for Thrawn, being someone that he can explain his thoughts and plans to for the benefit of the audience. But to me, the important part is that this is an Imperial soldier being portrayed a bit more human and a bit more rounded, something that later writers would expand on in other books. Through him, we get to see the Empire a bit more humanized and a bit less excessively evil than they were in the movies. It doesn't go as far as some other stories that are specifically about Imperial agents and Imperial soldiers, but does set things up nicely as a segue into stories that are more focused on humanizing the villains. Now, the other major villain, and one that I think doesn't really get a lot of attention these days, is Jorus C'baoth. Jorus C'baoth is in some ways the quintessential false teacher. He calls himself a Jedi and sees himself as a good person. But he's clearly going too far with his power and uses his power more for himself than for others, which is the main point of contention between him and Luke Skywalker once they finally meet. Unlike the Sith villains from the original movies, he isn't about selfishness, at least not directly. He doesn't see himself in that way. Instead, he argues that doing to be the wise Jedi who's in tune with the universe and has the ability to understand more than others, he therefore should be in charge, and that others should be obeying him for their own good. This is a very different kind of philosophy than Luke has been presented with from either Darth Vader or Yoda. This leads to a genuine, if short, philosophical argument when the two meet, and when very briefly, Luke assumes that C'baoth would know more about being a Jedi than he does. This puts C'baoth in a very interesting position where he can mislead Luke while Luke has no other teacher or mentor to turn to. He isn't doing this out of true malice. He seems to believe that what he's doing is right, that this is really the way that this Jedi should be going. This is quite a bit more nuanced than the very basic good versus evil that the original movies had, though while not itself the most complex, it sets up what could be some more nuanced moral arguments in other expanded universe material. Next, to address how he portrays some of our original heroes, I want to talk about Han, Leia, and Lando. First off, Han, who seems to just keep going on the same trajectory that he was in the original trilogy. That he is still a fundamentally good person, even if he isn't really big on rules and authority. In this, we see him pretty much having gone fully into dedicating himself to the Republic, fully into the ideals that he had been fighting for in the original trilogy. But he does still have some issues with following the rules, and does still often go full maverick, going off and doing what he thinks he needs to be doing. He seems to have ended up in a place where he doesn't really quite have an official position in the Republic. It's said that he had resigned his old officer position in the military and is married to Leia. They have twins on the way, and he's fully dedicated to this relationship, even if he and Leia do still butt heads a couple of times. I do think this fits with his characterization, especially if you have interpreted his original portrayal as being a fundamentally good person who has been made cynical and pragmatic by his life and by the state of the galaxy, rather than that being who he is just as standard. And with that interpretation, then, Han is just kind of returning to who he once was when he was younger, an actual idealist who has a problem with authorities who tell him to not do what he thinks is right. Now, Leia has a predictable position in this story. She's a high-ranking member of the New Republic government. I think she's basically the equivalent of an ambassador at large, but I might be wrong about that. We do see her go on a few diplomatic missions in the first book, and she's clearly still just as dedicated as ever to the ideals of the New Republic. The first book also establishes that she does in fact have the Force and can use it, and also get some use out of it in the story, but she isn't really dedicated to learning to use it for combat, and instead focuses on her actual diplomatic craft. We get to see this in the story as well, actually using diplomacy to make a very big difference, to the point that, arguably, Thrawn's actual defeat and death is due to Leia's actions. Her desire to go and help the Noghri, even though she didn't know the full situation and had reason to think that they were dangerous, is the true reason that they eventually turn on Thrawn, and eventually are his undoing. Lando is interesting. He gets to be, I think, more a part of the story than he was in the original movies, at least by virtue of appearing in the first book and then getting to actually go on the adventures with the other characters in the second and third. The moving city on Nicolin just really continues to establish that he is the kind of person to come up with the crazy schemes and actually have the cleverness to make them work, as well as still taking the high risk, high reward path to trying to get rich. But, especially in the second book, we get to see him team up and work with the other heroes, specifically Han and on a couple of occasions Luke. And we get to see him be the kind of clever and pragmatic person that balances out either Han's recklessness or Luke's idealism. I think this fits neatly with his movie characterization, and we simply get to see more of it in this series. There are also a couple of other new characters that I should talk about, specifically Talon Karrde and Mara Jade. Talon Karrde is the crime boss that the heroes end up interacting with in this story, and rather than being the pure evil crime lord that Jabba was, he represents a more gray take on organized crime. Someone who operates outside of authority, but still has his own sense of honor and fair trade. This, at least briefly, lets him get along with both the Empire and the New Republic. But eventually, by treating the heroes well and helping them when they're in trouble, he ends up on the wrong side of the Empire, and thus spends a lot of time avoiding them, eventually deciding that he needs to fight them, because they will end up getting rid of him once they win. He gets to follow a somewhat similar path to Han Solo from the original trilogy, but he doesn't go as far as Han did toward idealism. Mara Jade, however, is the other really well-known character that comes from this series. A former assassin for the Empire, and actually tasked with fighting and killing Luke Skywalker before the Battle of Endor. As of heir to the Empire, she's had to turn to a life of crime because, well, she can't exactly put secret assassin for the Emperor on her resume. She still harbors a great deal of hatred and anger for Luke Skywalker, both due to her failure to kill him and seeing that as being the thing that ruined her life and took away her position and power. She even believes that she's haunted by the ghost of Palpatine, still demanding that she carry out his last command. This is a bit ambiguous as to whether or not it's actually happening or it's just trauma. There's some evidence for both, but the important thing is that Mara Jade is still characterized as being driven by hatred and obsession, but this isn't directly related to the Force or the dark side. Outside of maybe Palpatine's Force Ghost messing with her, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Without being a Sith or being connected with the dark side of the Force, she's still motivated by elements that we consider to be of the dark side, hatred and obsession. Then, having to deal with the fact that Luke Skywalker is, a person and not an idea, and that he really only did what he had to do, is part of her character arc going through the story. Mara Jade would become a pretty big fan favorite character for several years afterwards, and I'm sure you can find other people who can tell you all about that. But here, what I want to point out is that her arc with Luke is still kind of about redemption without it being as overt or without it being as involved with the Force as the redemption of Darth Vader. And speaking of Luke, certainly you'll have to have noticed that I haven't brought him up yet. That's because I've been saving him for the end, because I definitely have the most to say about him. I absolutely love Timothy Zahn's portrayal of Luke Skywalker in the Thrawn Trilogy. It is, outside of the original trilogy itself, easily my favorite portrayal of the character. In the Thrawn Trilogy, Luke Skywalker is still very much the hero. He is almost as pure a hero as you can get while telling a war story. He still very much believes in redemption and mercy and in trying to find a non-violent solution to his problems. He tries very hard to still obey the law of the New Republic and to respect the wishes of others that he encounters, even though he still is a hero of the New Republic and, as such, often a target of the Empire, and he still does have to fight and kill throughout the story. Now, a lot of people, and this thought might be something that's been colored by my personal experience, but in my experience, a lot of people don't know what to do with a good hero. They don't see a way to have the character arc with this character if they are already good. They think they have to break that good down in some way, or that there needs to be some way that they aren't good, some particular flaw that they have to work on to be interesting. And Luke already had his arc in the original trilogy. So there are a lot of portrayals of Luke that are very bland because he's just there to be good guy Luke and not much else. Particularly, I could point to Dark Forces and Jedi Academy, where he is just kind of there saying very normal good guy things and not much else. Or, well, there are examples that go in the opposite direction and make the hero a worse person and think that it makes it more interesting, but I'm not going to get into that very much here. No, instead, Timothy Zahn is all focused on the fact that Luke now has to figure out what it means to be a Jedi and has pretty much no help left. The instructions he got from Obi-Wan and Yoda are basically a crash course on the idea of Jedi ethics and then a lot of combat training because he needed to fight Vader. So now he's got to figure out what it means to be a Jedi in not quite peacetime, but no longer being a war hero. He has several moments, especially in the first book, second guessing what he should be using the power of the Force for and what his position as Jedi actually means. To the point where, at the beginning of the first book, he'll use the power of the Force to mess with the minds of his enemies to make it easier to fight them, but later questions whether or not he should even be doing that and whether or not that is of the dark side. This question of what it means to be a Jedi is a representation of the idea of refining his moral code into something that can be more defined rather than just a simple proverb or gut feeling. This, I think, is a really interesting direction to take a hero that has already gone through their main character arc and addressed their flaws. The question of, now what? How do I take my idea of right and wrong and refine it into something that can survive more complicated situations of life in the future? With this, I kind of want to bring up two scenes from the second book, Dark Force Rising. Early on in the book, while Luke is waiting to meet Han and Lando at a bar, of course, he is asked by one of the patrons to resolve a situation. They see him. They know he's Luke Skywalker. I mean, he's carrying a lightsaber, so he has to be. He can solve their problem, right? You know, an argument between two people who are having disagreement. So Luke now has to negotiate for two people that he doesn't know, for a situation that he doesn't fully understand. But everyone is looking to him for answers, because he is Luke Skywalker, the Jedi Knight. Without going into details, he does have to improvise and get some help. Lando actually shows up and helps him with some information that he might not have had otherwise, but he does manage to resolve the situation, and both sides do end up accepting what he has said, even if it requires some compromise from them. The other situation is actually what happens at the very beginning of the book. See, at the end of the first book, Luke's X-Wing was out of commission, and he is currently at a shipyard that could repair it. But they're focused on repairing actual military vessels first. Luke's no longer part of the military, but he does think he needs to be back to Coruscant very quickly. He considers that he could just pull the, well, I'm Luke Skywalker, hero of the rebellion, on the people there to make them do it for him. Or he could borrow Wedge's X-Wing, which has its own problems. Eventually, there are some shenanigans where he does find out that there's been someone else interfering with the repair schedule. Lando offers to use some of these tools to actually put Luke's X-Wing up in front of the line so that he could get where he needs to be. It's a situation where Luke would need to do something legally wrong to hopefully do something right in the long run by being where he needs to be in a situation where he might be the only one who can do something. Interestingly, it's an offer that he accepts despite his misgivings, uncertain of whether or not he needs to be there. Easily the biggest thing to talk about with Luke and refining his moral code is his encounter in the second book with Jorus C'baoth, who, as I said before, is very much a person who believes that because he is powerful and wise, that he needs to be in charge, and that for the good of everyone else, that they just do what he says. He has a very practical Knight Templar style look at morality, that the ends justify the means, and importantly, that he is qualified to say when that is the case. Particularly in juxtaposition to how Luke felt about affecting the minds of his enemies, Jorus believes that it is a good thing for him to use the Force to psychically read the minds of people around him, that he can find out who was guilty and who was innocent when there are accusations of crime, that this can get the job done and solve the problem immediately, even if he is breaching someone's private mind for it. He feels the need to dole out punishment physically and immediately, which he does in front of Luke a couple of times. He even goes so far as revealed at the end of this encounter that he has been psychically pressuring Luke to accept what he is saying. This is what fully turns Luke against him, but Luke also argues with him on the basic level of ethics, the idea of using the Force only for protection, and that a Jedi should be dedicated to defense, something that C'baoth criticizes as being too simple and a child's view of morality. C'baoth thinks that the Jedi knows what's right and should just do it since they know better than anybody. This is a frankly arrogant view of morality which Luke recognizes and stands against. Of course, the other major relationship to talk about is Luke and Mara Jade. Mara Jade wants to kill Luke out of revenge for killing the Emperor and taking away the life that she used to have. Luke, once he finds out what is driving her, is very understanding of this. Obviously, he's not going to let her kill him, but he doesn't hold her hatred against her, instead patiently saying that it doesn't need to end in bloodshed, that she can move on and do something else with her life, which she kind of already has, but she's still obsessed with taking revenge on him. Eventually, for plot reasons, they do have to work together multiple times, even though Mara never really likes it. By the third book, they've gotten used to working together enough that they can actually be a good team, especially as Mara starts to use her connection to the Force and even gets a bit of a crash course on using the Force from Luke. By the end, Mara accepts that she doesn't need to kill Luke and that she's not really the one who wanted it in the first place. But the important thing here is that a large part of this is Luke's patience and understanding with her. He does not hold it against her, he does not reciprocate her anger, but he does encourage her to move on. Eventually, he puts enough trust in her to take her with him to the final fight against Jorus C'baoth, and afterwards even gives her his old lightsaber, which is, say, the lightsaber of Anakin Skywalker. All of this adds up to a characterization that I love for Luke Skywalker. He's a good person who is still trying to figure out how to do good. Every situation that he comes into that is more complicated, that he can't easily know what's right and wrong, he's still trying to figure it out. And he never stops trying to figure out the right thing to do and pursuing it, even when it becomes inconvenient or even when he fails. This is a characterization that I love seeing in a hero and something I really want to see more of. In fact, I really kind of think we could use more of this. The hero doesn't decide what's right and then just does that all the time. A hero is someone who keeps trying to do good. This set the stage of a Luke Skywalker that was going to stay a hero throughout the rest of the old expanded universe timeline, even though he did have other issues and other times he stumbled, particularly in the hands of other writers, but he was still always the hero, because here we see that he is still always trying to do the right thing. Honestly, it's my favorite thing about these books. So, hello and thank you for watching. This is the first time I've ever done this sort of postscript on the video, but this was a very important video for me. It's been about a year since I really started doing this, and this is the combination of about a year's worth of experience doing these scripts and doing some video editing. I'm pretty happy with it. I think I probably would have recorded it a few more times, except I got sick. You probably can hear it in my voice. So, I couldn't keep re-recording the lines for the 10th umpteenth time, or however many it was I ended up doing. But, this is the longest, most involved one. It's a subject I probably pretty obviously care about a lot. Hoping to do some more. Have some other things I wanted to do this month that I need to get around to. I'd really love to hear any feedback, good, bad, in between. And hope you'll stick around and watch me do some more stuff like this. Yeah, probably gonna go back to work on my game until I get another update done. Then come back and do another video essay. That's kind of the pattern I'm trying to do. Still trying to decide what the next game I'm going to play will be. Though I'm going to consistently come back to Star Wars stuff, I'm also going to be playing war stuff as well. But, as always, if you've watched, thank you very much for watching. That's my observation, and thank you for listening.